took this business from zero. Now the company's worth $7 billion.
Dana White is the most powerful man in all of mixed martial arts, but he also has a quick temper. And for today's video, we're going to take a look at 10 different fights that ruined his night completely. Now, without further ado, from the controversial and shocking to the downright boring, here are 10 fights that pissed off Dana White. Jalen Turner versus Bobby Green. A recent entry comes in first, and stoppage so awful that Dana immediately declared it the worst in the history of the UFC.
One of the worst I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Jalen Turner landed early on Bobby Green, dropping him to the canvas to kick off a brutal finishing sequence. And while 99% of refs would have called it off there and then, Kerry Hatley seemed to think that Green was still in it. In fact, he let Turner land another 6 or 7 unanswered blows before jumping in. It was a bad one, folks.
He's out again! Maybe more than that was disgusting.
Every fan in the arena knew that the stoppage was horrific. And for Bobby Green, who was clearly concussed, that's the type of damage that can have real consequences moving forward, especially for a fighter of his age. Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou 1. Considering how badly their relationship would eventually suffer, the initial rise of Francis Ngannou through the heavyweight ranks saw Dana White and his team latch onto him as a real promotional golden boy. By the time Ngannou had KO'd Overeem and set himself up for his first title, Dana could barely contain his excitement. He was very clearly hoping for an Ngannou win pre-fight, so much so that many fans seemed to think that he was forgetting that Stipe Miocic was literally one fight away from becoming the longest-serving heavyweight champ in UFC history. In other words, Dana was all over Ngannou, and Stipe was left sitting to the side with very little work from the hype machine. So when Miocic went out and dominated Ngannou for 5 rounds, exposing his shortcomings for the world to see, Dana was furious. And to make matters worse, Stipe snubbed the UFC president post-fight, motioning to his coach to put the belt around his waist instead, just to prove a point. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor. Just because the UFC had the biggest night in their entire history didn't mean that UFC 229 was all laughs and smiles for Dana White. No, unfortunately for him, seconds after watching his biggest star having a reputation-altering loss, Dana had to deal with a PR nightmare when the fight's victor, Khabib Nurmagomedov, vaulted over the side of the cage to attack Team McGregor's Dylan Dennis.
Now Khabib jumps the fence. Whoa! And he's going right at Dylan Dennis.
A brawl broke out, and White couldn't hide his anger at the Eagle post-fight. Now, of course, as time went on, this incident has come to be known as maybe the most epic post-fight moment of all time. But on that night, Dana's face has never been redder. Josh Koscheck versus Paul Daley. Josh Koscheck is easy to hate. The guy played the villain so well during his prime years. And in his now infamous fight with Paul Daley, he really didn't earn himself any fans when he faked getting hit by an illegal knee just to get Daley deducted points by the referee.
Top! Nicely done, Paul Daley. Illegal knee, no way!
If that was all that happened in this fight, you could very easily cast Daley as a sympathetic figure in defeat. But when Semtex walked over to Koscheck after the fight and sucker punched him, he booked a one-way ticket out of the UFC. In fact, Dana pretty much cut him from the roster within an hour of this happening.
He's done. I don't give a shit if he's the best 170-pounder in the world. He'll never come back here again.
We're talking Paul Daley.
Yeah.
And we gotta say, it's hard not to agree with the UFC prez on this one. Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz 3. When Chuck Liddell finally retired from MMA after a string of KO losses, it came after Dana White basically begged him to do so.
Chuck Liddell is 50 years old and should not be fighting.
As a longtime friend of the Iceman, White saw just how depleted Chuck was with each passing fight, and ensured that he would be well taken care of if he bowed out of the sport gracefully. So 8 years later, when Dana's 2 biggest enemies, Oscar De La Hoya and Tito Ortiz, joined forces to bring a 48-year-old Liddell out of retirement for a quick payday to give Ortiz the chance to finally beat his biggest rival? Yeah, this one hurt. Liddell looked truly awful in there, and Dana didn't hold back in criticizing this fight, before and after it took place. Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. Some fights just jump off the page when you read them on a lineup. Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero was one of those bouts, a clash between the best striker in MMA and its biggest genetic freak. But knowing how much these two rely on their opponent's offense to counter, we should have seen this coming. Adesanya vs. Romero was a snoozer, a bona fide stinker that brought virtually no action to the table across 5 rounds. And the impact of this fight was made even worse by the fact that we just watched Weili Zhang and Joanna Jędrzejczyk put on the single greatest fight in women's MMA history. Dana hated this one. I hated this one, and I'm sure all of you did as well. An absolutely terrible title matchup and pay-per-view main event. Anderson Silva vs. Demian Maia. The UFC had a lot riding on their Abu Dhabi debut in 2010, UFC 112. So much so that they decided to bring out the big guns, setting up big matchups like Matt Hughes vs. Renzo Gracie and Frankie Edgar vs. BJ Penn to fill up the card. But the biggest attraction was undoubtedly Anderson Silva, a living legend who looked to further his GOAT argument by taking out the BJJ master Demian Maia. With a truly massive striking advantage, it seemed certain that the Spider would score the finish and deny Maia the chance to get the fight to the ground. What we got in the end was one of the strangest fights in UFC history. Silva basically outpointed Maia and then started play acting in the final rounds, showing no desire to engage, much to the annoyance of the fans, and Dana did not hold back in criticizing the middleweight king post-fight. It's a bout that Dana is probably still embarrassed about to this day. Jon Jones vs. Matt Hamill. You know a fight's result is a rough one for Dana if it's still bothering him over a decade later. Jon Jones' sole loss in his career was, of course, a DQ to Matt Hamill in a fight he was totally dominating. That DQ came due to his use of illegal 12-6 downward elbows. At the time, we didn't know how much of a stain this would leave on Jones' otherwise perfect fighting record. But years later, Dana White would actually try to have this fight's result overturned, just so Jones could have the privilege of holding the single greatest unbeaten record in MMA history. Dana didn't succeed, and we're sure he wasn't happy about that. Not one bit. George St. Pierre vs. Johnny Hendricks. Ask Dana White now, and he'll tell you that George St. Pierre was an absolute pleasure to work with, a legend of the sport who never engaged in the type of controversy that has wreaked havoc on the legacy of a guy like Jon Jones or Conor McGregor, for example. But when GSP decided to retire on the spot after winning an extremely narrow and controversial decision over Johnny Hendricks, yeah, Dana was not pleased. He immediately turned on St. Pierre in his post-fight press conference, criticizing his decision to leave on a result like that. Sure, they would eventually make up, but Dana has never been afraid to try and ruin a fighter's reputation if they cross him. That's for sure. Francis Ngannou vs. Cyril Gane. A second appearance for Francis Ngannou comes in next, but for a totally different reason than his first. By the time Ngannou's title defense against Cyril Gane came around, he had transformed himself from failed hype job to perhaps the single most proven knockout artist in the history of the sport. But his relationship with Dana and the UFC never recovered. In fact, it got worse due to Ngannou's growth into an anti-establishment hero. Francis spoke out against the company often, criticizing their treatment of fighters while doing his utmost to try and get out of his restrictive contract. The UFC knew that they would lose Ngannou after his title defense with Cyril Gane, so the ideal situation for them would have been for the Frenchman to swoop in and beat Francis, leaving him without his belt. But Ngannou won the fight on the scorecards, out-wrestling the master striker to edge him out over 5 rounds. Dana was so pissed off that he didn't even hang around to put Ngannou's belt on him post-fight. So which controversial fight did you like the most? Do let me know in the comments below. Thanks guys for watching. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. We'll see you guys in the next one.